Imagine this. I'm out on a peaceful Saturday morning, my fishing rod dangling over the crystal-clear lake, when a drone buzzes into view, hovering just above the water like some futuristic intruder. Moments later, a woman in a flashy green eco-suit and Gucci sunglasses struts up, flanked by a young guy with a camera, acting like she owns the place. "We're surveying for an environmental event on your lake," she declares, her tone dripping with authority, as if I'm just a tenant on her turf. Meet Becca Langston, HOA president and self-proclaimed director of Arizona Green Living, who's decided my little oasis is too vital to the ecosystem for one guy to enjoy solo. I glance at my fishing rod, then back at her smug smile, and it hits me. She's not here for science. My name's Travis Collier, a 41-year-old geology and water conservation professor at Arizona State University. And this lake? It's my legacy. I inherited it from my grandfather, a legendary geologist, along with his decades of research on this natural spring-fed wonder. Nestled within my property boundaries, surrounded by native mesquite trees and desert flora, this half-acre gem is home to rare desert fish and birds, a quiet haven I've cherished for 3 years in the upscale Desert Hills estates. That peace lasted until Becca and her contractor husband Marcus moved in 6 months ago, snagging the HOA presidency and turning the neighborhood upside down with bi-weekly emergency meetings and improvement projects that seemed to favor a lucky few. I kept my head down, lost in teaching and research, oblivious that my lake had become the target of her grand ambitions. But that morning, watching her orchestrate her drone shoot and deliver her polished spiel about ecosystems, something clicked. This wasn't just a nosy neighbor, it was a calculated move, complete with rehearsed lines and a camera crew, like she was building a case before I even knew the fight had begun. Which city of the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share with us if you have any confrontation with the HOA. We will narrate your story on our channel. I set down my fishing rod and walked closer to where she stood, noting how her cameraman positioned himself to capture both of us in the frame. "Ma'am, I appreciate your environmental concerns, but this is private property. The lake belongs to my family, and it's been protected and studied by professional geologists for over 30 years. Becca's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind those designer sunglasses. "Travis, I think you misunderstand the situation. Arizona Green Living has conducted preliminary surveys that show concerning levels of potential contamination in this water source. As HOA president, I have a responsibility to protect our community's health and environmental standards. We're not asking for your permission. We're informing you of our intentions to properly manage this resource for everyone's benefit." She handed me a folder that looked official but felt flimsy, filled with what appeared to be scientific reports that made no sense to someone who actually understood water quality testing. The numbers were wrong, the methodology was fabricated, and the conclusions were completely divorced from reality. But it looked convincing enough to fool someone without my background. I felt my professional pride bristle as I scanned the fake environmental report. 30 years of legitimate research by my grandfather, followed by my own continued studies. And this woman was standing here with fabricated data trying to justify stealing my family's property. "These reports are completely inaccurate," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the growing anger. "The contamination levels you're citing don't exist, and your methodology doesn't follow any recognized environmental testing standards. I'd be happy to show you the real scientific documentation of this lake's pristine condition," but Becca was already backing away, her cameraman still rolling, capturing what I realized was probably intended to be my unreasonable refusal to cooperate with environmental protection efforts. "Travis, I hope you understand your responsibility to this community," Becca said, her voice taking on a patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. We'll be in touch soon to discuss the transition process. I'm sure once you review all the documentation and consider the legal implications, you'll see that cooperation is in everyone's best interest." She turned and walked away with her little entourage, but not before her cameraman got a final shot of me standing alone by my lake, probably looking like the stubborn homeowner refusing to do his part for the environment. As I watched them disappear around the corner, I couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was just the opening move in a much larger game. That evening, I sat on my back porch looking out at the lake, trying to process what had happened. The water reflected the Arizona sunset, just as it had for my grandfather and his grandfather before him. This wasn't just about property rights, it was about family legacy, scientific integrity, and the growing realization that Becca Langston had plans that went far beyond environmental protection. I pulled out my laptop and started researching everything I could find about Arizona green living, HOA regulations, and anything else connected to Becca's operation. What I found in those first few hours of digging would prove to be just the tip of a very ugly iceberg. But I had no idea yet just how deep this rabbit hole would go. I woke up Sunday morning to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. My first clue that something was seriously wrong came from my colleague, Dr. Sarah Martinez, who sent me a link with the message, "Travis, what the hell is this?" The link led to a video titled, "Geology Professor Hoards Desert Water While Community Suffers," posted by someone called Kyle Morrison, who apparently had over 50,000 subscribers to his real estate investment channel. The video showed carefully edited footage from yesterday's encounter with my responses chopped up to make me look like an unreasonable, selfish property owner refusing to share vital water resources with struggling families. Kyle's commentary painted me as an auto-fouch academic who valued his personal fishing hobby over community welfare and environmental protection. The video had been posted at 6 in the morning and already had over 3,000 likes and hundreds of comments calling me everything from typical privileged professor to much worse. But what really made my blood boil was seeing how they'd twisted my grandfather's scientific legacy, portraying decades of legitimate geological research as hoarding natural research for personal gain. Kyle Morrison had clearly been briefed with talking points that sounded environmental and community-minded, but were actually designed to make me look like the villain in a story about water rights and social responsibility. The comment section was filled with people who had no idea about the real situation, sharing their own stories about water shortages and HOA disputes, all directed at me as the face of selfish homeowner privilege. By 10 in the morning, I discovered that Kyle's video was just the beginning. Becca had launched a coordinated social media campaign called Save Our Desert Lake with professional graphics, a petition that already had over 800 signatures and carefully crafted posts on multiple platforms describing the urgent need to protect community water resources from private monopolization. The campaign featured photos of my lake that had clearly been taken without my permission, along with statistics about Arizona's water crisis that had nothing to do with my small natural spring, but were designed to make my ownership look unconscionable. Tiffany Chin, who I now learned was the HOA's vice president and apparently some kind of marketing professional, had created content that looked like it came from a legitimate environmental organization. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. My university email was flooded with messages from colleagues asking if the allegations were true. Students wanting to know if their professor was really the kind of person who would deprive communities of water and complete. Strangers who had somehow found my contact information to express their outrage. The department head called me into his office Monday morning for what he diplomatically called a conversation about the university's public image, though he made it clear that he believed my side of the story. Still, the fact that I was having To defend my character and professional integrity based on a fabricated controversy was infuriating and exhausting in ways I hadn't expected. But the real wake-up call came when I started digging deeper into Becca's background. Late Monday night, unable to sleep after another day of dealing with the fallout from Kyle's video, I found myself deep in online forums and community discussion boards. That's when I stumbled across a discussion thread from 2 years ago with the title HOA President Scammed Us in Nevada Photos Inside. The photos showed a woman who looked exactly like Becca, but the post referred to her as Rebecca Martinez. And the story described almost identical tactics, fake environmental concerns, manufactured community crises, and systematic manipulation of HOA resources for personal gain. The thread had dozens of responses from residents describing how Rebecca had nearly destroyed their community before disappearing overnight when legal pressure mounted. My hands were shaking as I screenshot everything and started cross-referencing names, dates, and locations. Rebecca Martinez in Nevada, Becky Lang in California, Rebecca Stone in Phoenix. Each identity associated with HOA controversies, environmental fraud, and communities left dealing with financial and legal messes after her departure. The pattern was clear. Becca Langston was a professional scam artist who specialized in infiltrating homeowner associations, manufacturing environmental crises, and using community resources to fund elaborate schemes that ultimately benefited only herself and her accomplices. The realization that I was dealing with someone who had refined these tactics across multiple states and communities was both terrifying and oddly reassuring. At least now I understood that this was never really about my lake. Tuesday morning brought an anonymous email that would change everything. Check the business registration for Arizona Green Living. Look at the incorporation date and cross-record it with Becca's residency timeline. Also, Marcus Langston has building permits filed for a resort development project that requires water access. Connect the dots. The message had no signature and came from a clearly temporary email address, but it provided exactly the kind of concrete leads I needed to start building a real case. I spent the rest of the day researching business registrations, permit applications, and public records, slowly, piecing together a picture that was far worse than simple HOA overreach. Arizona Green Living had been incorporated just 3 weeks before Becca moved to Desert Hills Estates, with no actual environmental projects, no legitimate funding sources, and no staff beyond Becca herself. The organization existed only on paper and online, designed to look credible enough to justify her actions, but with no substance behind the facade. Meanwhile, Marcus Langston had quietly filed preliminary paperwork for a luxury desert resort project that specifically mentioned exclusive water feature access as a key selling point. The timeline made it clear that they had targeted my property from the moment they moved to the neighborhood, probably after researching property records and identifying the lake as the perfect centerpiece for their development scheme. As I prepared for bed Tuesday night, I felt a mixture of rage and determination that I hadn't experienced since graduate school. These people had invaded my community, attacked my reputation, and tried to steal my family's legacy through an elaborate fraud that they'd apparently perfected in other states. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd chosen to target someone who understood both the science they were faking and had the resources to fight back. I opened my laptop and composed an email to Danielle Harper, my old college friend, who had become one of Arizona's most respected real estate and environmental attorneys. Danny, I need your help. Not just legal advice, I need to go to war. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center, and I knew this was going to be the main event. Becca had spent the week building momentum through her social media campaign, and I'd heard from neighbors that local news stations had been contacted about covering the water rights controversy in Desert Hills Estates. I spent Wednesday night preparing a folder of actual scientific documentation about the lake, including my grandfather's research, recent water quality reports, and property surveys that clearly showed the lake's location entirely within my boundaries. I also printed copies of the business registration information for Arizona Green Living, though I wasn't sure yet how to present that without revealing my source. Walking into the community center felt like entering a courtroom where the jury had already been selected by the opposing side. The room held about 60 people, which was at least 3 times the normal attendance for HOA meetings. And I immediately noticed several faces I didn't recognize who were clearly not residents. Kyle Morrison was there with his camera equipment setting up in the back corner with a clear view of the entire room. 2 people who looked like local news reporters were positioned strategically with their own cameras, and I realized that Becca had orchestrated this entire meeting as a media event designed to create public pressure for her position. The whole thing felt like a trap, but I was committed to defending myself and my property. Becca started the meeting by presenting what she called urgent environmental findings that required immediate community action. She had a PowerPoint presentation filled with impressive-looking graphs and charts, all showing various contamination levels and environmental risks associated with unmanaged water resources in residential areas. Her presentation was polished and professional, clearly designed to overwhelm the audience with scientific-sounding information that was complete nonsense to anyone who actually understood environmental science. She talked about community responsibility, environmental stewardship, and protecting future generations, all while showing slides that had nothing to do with the actual conditions at my lake. When she finished her presentation, Becca opened the floor for community discussion, but it quickly became clear that several of the speakers had been prepared in advance. Tiffany Chen spoke about property values and community image. Roger Blake presented financial projections showing how proper lake management could benefit everyone's property values, and 3 residents I barely knew all gave passionate speeches about the importance of shared community resources. Each speaker reinforced the same message. I was being selfish by maintaining private ownership of a resource that could benefit the entire community, and environmental concerns made it irresponsible to leave such an important water source under individual control. When I finally got a chance to speak, I felt like I was swimming upstream against a current of manufactured outrage and professional manipulation. I presented the real scientific data about the lake's condition, explained the legitimate research that had been conducted there for decades, and showed the property surveys that proved the lake's location entirely within my boundaries. But every point I made was immediately countered by Becca or one of her allies, who redirected the conversation back to community benefit and environmental responsibility. The audience seemed to have already made up their minds based on the social media campaign, and my scientific evidence was dismissed as technical details that missed the bigger picture of community cooperation. The turning point came when someone in the audience shouted, "If you're so concerned about the environment, why won't you let environmental experts manage the lake properly?" That comment triggered a round of applause and vocal agreement that made it clear how effectively Becca's campaign had shaped public opinion. I tried to explain that I was an environmental expert, that my grandfather had been a respected geologist, and that the lake was already being managed according to the highest scientific standards. But my voice was drowned out by increasingly hostile questions about my refusal to cooperate and demands to know what I was really trying to hide by maintaining private control over such an important community resource. The meeting reached its climax when Becca stood up and announced that the HOA board had voted to implement new community resource management guidelines that would take effect immediately. According to these new rules, any private property that contained essential community resources would be subject to HOA oversight and management in the interest of community welfare and environmental protection. The announcement was met with thunderous applause from most of the audience, while I sat there trying to process the legal implications of what she just said. I knew enough about property law to understand that HOAs couldn't simply declare private property subject to community management, but the crowd clearly believed they had just witnessed a democratic solution to a community problem. As the meeting broke up, I found myself surrounded by neighbors expressing everything from disappointment to outright anger about my selfish attitude. Kyle Morrison approached me with his camera still rolling, asking for a comment about the community's decision and whether I intended to continue fighting against environmental protection efforts. I managed to say something about respecting property rights and following proper legal procedures, but I knew my words would be edited to support whatever narrative he wanted to create. Walking to my car, I overheard Tiffany Chen talking to one of the news reporters about organizing a community lake restoration event for the following weekend with or without my cooperation. Driving home from that meeting, I felt a combination of rage, humiliation, and determination that crystallized into a single clear decision. These people had turned my neighbors against me through lies and manipulation, used fake environmental science to justify theft of my family's property, and now planned to simply take what they wanted regardless of legal rights or factual reality. But they had also made their intentions public, created a documented record of their actions, and revealed enough information about their broader scheme to give me the ammunition I needed to fight back. I pulled into my driveway, looked out at the lake that had been peacefully reflecting moonlight for generations, and made the phone call that would change everything. "Danny, it's Travis. I need to see you first thing tomorrow morning, and I need you to bring everything you know about fighting HOA fraud." Daniel Harper's law office in Scottsdale felt like a sanctuary after the chaos of the past week. I'd known Danny since our undergraduate days at Arizona State, where she'd been the kind of student who could dissect complex legal theories while everyone else was still trying to understand the basic concepts. After law school, she'd built a reputation as one of Arizona's most effective attorneys, specializing in real estate disputes and environmental law, which made her exactly the right person to help me navigate this situation. When I walked into her office Friday morning with 2 boxes of documentation and a laptop full of research, she took one look at my face and immediately cleared her schedule for the rest of the day. "Travis, I've been following the social media drama about your lake, and I have to tell you, whoever is running this operation against you is very good at what they do," Danny said, as she reviewed the fake environmental reports that Becca had distributed. "This is sophisticated fraud designed to look legitimate to people who don't understand environmental science. But here's the thing, they've made several critical mistakes that we can use against them. First, Arizona Green Living isn't properly registered as a legitimate environmental organization, which means all their official sounding reports and recommendations have no legal standing. Second, the HOA's new Community Resource Management Guidelines violate multiple state laws regarding property rights and can't be legally enforced. But Danny's real area of expertise became apparent when she started explaining the broader legal implications of what Becca and her team were attempting. What you're dealing with isn't just an aggressive HOA president. This is an organized scheme to defraud property owners through fake environmental claims and manufactured community crisis. Based on the patterns you've identified in other states, Becca Langston is part of a network that specializes in these kinds of operations. They target communities with valuable private resources, create artificial environmental emergencies, and use social manipulation to pressure property owners into surrendering control of valuable assets. The evidence I'd gathered about Marcus Langston's resort development plans provided the key to understanding their ultimate goal. Danny showed me how the preliminary permits he'd filed included specific references to water features and luxury, amenities that could only make sense if they had already assumed control of my lake. They're not planning to manage your lake for environmental protection. They're planning to incorporate it into a commercial development project that would generate significant profits. She explained, the environmental protection angle is just the public relations strategy they're using to justify taking your property without compensation. Our strategy session revealed that Becca and her team had been more thorough than I had initially realized, but they'd also left more evidence than they probably intended. Dye's investigation into Arizona Green Living uncovered that the organization had received several thousand in donations from community members who believed they were supporting legitimate environmental protection efforts. These donations had been used to fund Kyle Morrison's video production, pay for the professional graphics and social media campaigns, and probably compensate other participants in the scheme. This isn't just property theft, it's also charitable fraud and wire fraud involving multiple victims across several states. The breakthrough came when Danny suggested that we turn Becca's own tactics against her by documenting everything she was doing while pretending to cooperate with her demands. Right now, she thinks she's winning because you're reacting defensively to her public relations campaign. But what if we let her think she succeeded while we gather evidence of everything she's really planning to do with your property? The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would contact Becca and request a private meeting to discuss negotiating a compromise that would allow community access to the lake while preserving my property rights. During this meeting, I would record everything while encouraging her to explain her long-term plans. Saturday afternoon, I called Becca and used my most defeated voice to request a meeting. Becca, I've been thinking about everything that happened at the HOA meeting, and I realized I may have been too focused on technical details rather than community needs. Would you be willing to sit down with me and discuss what a compromise might look like? Her response was exactly what Danny had predicted, barely concealed triumph mixed with patronizing sympathy for my willingness to finally see reason. We agreed to meet at my house Sunday afternoon, where she could assess the lake situation and explain what kind of community management structure would be most beneficial for everyone involved. Preparing for that meeting felt like preparing for a battle, except that success would depend on appearing defeated rather than strong. Danny helped me set up discreet recording equipment and coached me on how to ask questions that would encourage Becca to reveal information about her real plans and the broader network of people involved in the scheme. We also arranged for a professional surveyor to conduct an independent assessment of my property boundaries, which would provide legal documentation of the lake's location entirely within my land. The key is to let her think she's already won. Danny explained, overconfident criminals always reveal more than they intend to when they think they're safe. Sunday morning, I stood on my back porch looking out at the lake and felt a sense of calm determination that I hadn't experienced since this whole ordeal began. Instead of being the victim of an elaborate fraud, I was about to become the architect of its downfall. The lake reflected the Arizona morning sun just as it had for my grandfather and generations before him, but now it would serve an additional purpose as the centerpiece of evidence that would expose Becca Langston and her network of accomplices. I checked the recording equipment one final time, reviewed my list of strategic questions, and prepared to give the performance of my lifetime as a defeated property owner ready to surrender to community pressure. When Becca arrived that afternoon with Tiffany Chen and a man I didn't recognize who introduced himself as a community development consultant, I knew we were about to capture evidence that would change everything, but I had no idea just how much. They were prepared to reveal when they thought they were talking to someone who had already given up the fight. The conversation that followed would provide everything Danny needed to not only protect my property, but to launch a comprehensive legal assault that would expose the entire operation and protect other communities from falling victim to the same scheme. I woke up Monday morning and saw the entire area around my lake surrounded by orange construction fencing with signs reading, "Environmental remediation in progress, authorized personnel only," looking exactly like a legitimate construction site. right on my own land. The sight hit me like a physical blow, not just because of the audacity, but because of how professionally executed the whole operation appeared. This wasn't some amateur property grab. This was sophisticated theft disguised as environmental protection. The recording session with Becca the previous afternoon had been even more revealing than Danny and I had hoped. Once Becca believed I was ready to surrender, she'd outlined the entire plan with shocking detail. The lake would be temporarily managed by Arizona Green Living while they conducted comprehensive environmental assessment, after which it would be incorporated into Marcus's resort development as a community amenity. She'd explained how the social media campaign had been designed to create public pressure, how the fake environmental reports had been crafted to justify their actions, and how similar operations in other states had generated millions of dollars in profits through property acquisition and development schemes. But seeing the construction fencing made it clear that Becca had decided to move ahead with physical takeover regardless of legal considerations. I called the police, but the responding officer explained that the situation was complicated by the apparently legitimate permits and environmental documentation that Becca's team had prepared. "Sir, I understand this is your property, but they have what appear to be proper county permits for environmental remediation work, and the HOA has provided documentation showing community authorization for emergency environmental protection measures. You'll need to resolve this through the courts." The helplessness I felt was unlike anything I'd experienced as an adult. Standing in my own backyard, unable to access a lake that had been in my family for generations, while construction workers, hired by people with no legal right, went about their business as though I didn't exist. The worst part was seeing neighbors walk by with their dogs, some stopping to chat with workers about how wonderful it was that the community was finally taking proper care of the lake. Becca's propaganda campaign had been so effective that people actually believed this theft was environmental protection. Kyle appeared with his camera, excited as if he just witnessed a historic community victory. In his video, I stood helplessly behind the fence, exactly the image of the environmental saboteur they'd been building. His footage made me look like what Becca wanted, a defeated homeowner forced to surrender private control of community resources for the greater good. The video would later show me standing helplessly while he narrated about stubborn property owners who finally had to accept community responsibility. That night, I sat in my kitchen staring out at the floodlights that now illuminated the construction area around my lake and felt something shift inside me. The combination of rage, humiliation, and determination crystallized into cold, calculating resolve. These people had stolen my family's legacy through elaborate fraud, turned my community against me with lies, and were literally camping on my property while planning to profit from their theft. But they'd also become overconfident, created extensive documentation of their criminal activities, and given me everything needed to destroy them completely. That evening brought the perfect opportunity when Marcus Langston arrived with what appeared to be representatives from a luxury hospitality company, giving them a tour of the future resort amenity while pointing out ideal locations for cabanas, decking, and other commercial developments. I was able to photograph and video record the entire tour from my bedroom window, capturing conversations about square footage, capacity limits, and revenue projections that made it clear this had never been about environmental protection. The evidence was so damning that Danny immediately filed for an emergency injunction. The injunction hearing, Wednesday afternoon, felt like the first moment in weeks where I had any control. Danny presented our evidence systematically. Fake environmental reports, business registration fraud, recorded conversations revealing the true purpose, and photographic evidence of commercial planning for my private property. The judge's reaction was immediate and decisive. He granted the injunction, stopping all work, and ordered immediate removal of all construction equipment and personnel from my property, pending full investigation. Watching the construction fencing come down. Wednesday evening felt like the first real victory, but I knew it was just the beginning. The look on Becca's face when sheriff's deputies informed her she was no longer authorized on my property told me everything about how confident she'd been that her scheme would succeed. As she gathered her people and equipment to leave, she turned back with an expression of pure hatred. "This isn't finished, Travis," she said loud enough for deputies to hear. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Standing by my lake that evening, finally able to access my own property again, I felt a mixture of relief and anticipation that was both satisfying and terrifying. We'd won the first real battle, but Danny had warned me that people like Becca don't surrender easily when millions of dollars are at stake. The comprehensive lawsuit we were preparing would expose their entire operation, but it would also make us targets for whatever desperate measures they might attempt as their scheme collapsed. That night, I called Danny with just one sentence. "This isn't about protecting heritage anymore. I want to sue this entire system and make it a lesson for the whole country." Her response was music to my ears. "Travis, based on the evidence we've gathered, we can file federal charges for wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy. We can pursue civil damages under Arizona's racketeering statutes and probably recover assets they've hidden in other states. But most importantly, we can set precedents that will protect other communities from ever facing this again." Looking out at the water that reflected the desert sunsets just as it had for generations, I realized the real war was just beginning, and the outcome would determine not just my family's legacy, but the future of every community that criminals like Becca Langston might target next. The lake had served as bait for their greed, but now it would become the centerpiece of evidence that would expose their entire criminal network and protect countless other families from falling victim to the same sophisticated fraud. The federal courthouse was packed. My entire neighborhood was there, along with victims from Nevada and California. Reporters crowded the hallways. This wasn't just about my lake anymore. This had become a national legal lesson about HOA fraud and environmental scams. The media attention was intense, with coverage ranging from local papers to national outlets following HOA abuse stories, and social media buzzing with updates about the Desert Lake HOA scandal. Danielle's opening statement was a masterpiece of legal storytelling that connected all our evidence into a comprehensive narrative of deliberate fraud and conspiracy. She presented the timeline of Becca's operations across multiple states, the systematic nature of her property targeting, and the sophisticated network of accomplices who had helped execute schemes that had stolen millions from property owners and community members who believed they were supporting legitimate environmental protection. The evidence included bank records, communication logs, business registrations, and recorded conversations painting a picture of organized criminal activity disguised as community activism. Roger, the HOA treasurer, testified that he'd been coerced into cooperation through threats related to personal information that Becca had somehow discovered and used as leverage. He revealed the entire system of fabricated environmental reports, HOA funds diverted to pay for media campaigns, and manufactured community pressure from fake grassroots support. His insider testimony provided crucial details about how the scheme operated. Environmental reports were purchased from corrupt consultants. Social media campaigns were funded through misdirected dues and fraudulent donations, and local officials were influenced through bribes and manufactured community pressure. The turning point came when Danielle presented evidence from Becca's previous operations in Nevada. She had stolen control of a community swimming pool through similar environmental fraud tactics, ultimately selling the facility to a private company for over $800,000, while the original community received nothing. In California, she had manipulated a homeowners association into surrendering communally owned parkland that was then developed into luxury housing generating over $2 million in profits while destroying community amenities that residents had been paying to maintain. But the most damaging evidence came from recordings of Becca's conversations during our fake negotiation meeting, where she explicitly described how the lake would be incorporated into Marcus's resort development project. The audio was crystal clear as she explained how environmental protection was simply the story we tell the public, while the real goal was commercial development that would generate at least $5 million in revenue over the first 3 years. Her casual discussion of manipulating community sentiment and manufacturing environmental crises provided perfect evidence of criminal intent and conspiracy. The defense tried portraying Becca as a misguided environmental activist whose methods might have been questionable, but whose intentions were genuinely focused on community benefit. However, this narrative collapsed when the prosecution presented financial records showing how donations to Arizona Green Living had been diverted to personal accounts, how environmental testing had never actually been conducted, and how the entire organization existed only as a front for property acquisition schemes. The evidence was so overwhelming that even Becca's expensive attorneys seemed to realize their case was hopeless. Marcus Langston's testimony provided the final evidence when he admitted under oath that the resort development project had been planned from the moment they moved to Desert Hills Estates, and that acquiring control of My Lake had always been essential to the project's profitability. His admission that they had researched property records before choosing where to live, specifically targeting communities with valuable private resources that could be acquired through HOA manipulation, demonstrated the premeditated nature of their crimes and the systematic approach they used to identify and exploit vulnerable communities. The judge's decision was swift and comprehensive. Becca received 8 years in federal prison for wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy charges, while Marcus got 6 years for his role in the scheme. Arizona Green Living was dissolved and its assets seized to provide restitution to victims across multiple states. I was awarded $250,000 in damages, and My Lake received absolute protection. More importantly, the case established legal precedents that would make it much harder for future criminals to use environmental protection claims as cover for property theft. But the broader impact was equally significant. The class action settlement provided compensation to dozens of other victims who had been defrauded through similar schemes across 4 states. Federal investigators discovered hidden assets that Becca and Marcus had accumulated through years of systematic fraud, allowing for substantial restitution to communities and individuals who had lost money, property, and trust through their elaborate scams. The case would be studied in law schools and referenced in future HOA fraud prosecutions. The satisfaction went far beyond personal vindication. We had exposed an entire network of criminals who had been systematically targeting communities across the American Southwest, stealing property and life savings from families who believe they were supporting legitimate environmental and community improvement efforts. The recording techniques we used to document Becca's admissions were incorporated into law enforcement training programs, and the financial investigation methods helped prosecutors in other states recover millions in stolen assets. Walking out of the courthouse that afternoon, I felt satisfaction that transcended personal victory. We hadn't just protected my family's lake. We'd created a model for other communities facing similar threats and established legal precedents that would make such schemes much harder to execute in the future. The lake would continue serving as a site of scientific research and community education, just as my grandfather intended. But now it would also stand as proof that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary justice when they refused to be intimidated by those who would steal their heritage and destroy their communities. The truth had won even when temporarily obscured by sophisticated lies and manipulation, proving that justice was still possible when people were willing to stand up for facts and work together to expose those who would exploit their trust and steal their futures. 6 months after the trial, I stood on my back porch on a perfect Saturday morning in May, watching families from throughout Desert Hills estates enjoy the first annual Desert Lake Conservation Day that had become our community's new favorite tradition. Children were learning about desert ecosystems from volunteer scientists, parents were participating in water conservation workshops, and everyone was enjoying the peaceful beauty of a natural lake that had been protected and preserved rather than exploited and destroyed. The scene was everything I had hoped for when I first inherited this property. A perfect blend of education, conservation, and community enjoyment that honored both the scientific legacy my grandfather had established and the social connections that make neighborhoods worth living in. The transformation of our community had been remarkable to witness. Once the truth about Becca's scheme became public, neighbors who had been manipulated into supporting her environmental protection narrative were genuinely embarrassed about how easily they had been deceived and eager to make amends for their role in the controversy. The HOA elected new leadership committed to transparency and actual community improvement rather than manufactured crises designed to benefit a few insiders. Property values had actually increased as news coverage of our successful fight against organized fraud attracted buyers who wanted to live in a community that had proven its ability to come together and protect itself against external threats. Kyle Morrison had been one of the most surprising developments in the aftermath of the trial. Once he realized how completely he had been manipulated into creating propaganda for a criminal enterprise, he contacted me directly to apologize and offered to use his platform to educate people about HOA fraud tactics. His follow-up videos about recognizing and resisting property scams had gone viral in a positive way, helping thousands of homeowners across the country identify red flags and protect themselves from similar schemes. He had also provided crucial assistance in helping federal investigators track down other victims of Becca's network who might never have come forward without his outreach efforts. The financial recovery had exceeded even Danielle's optimistic projections as federal investigators discovered assets that Becca and Marcus had hidden in accounts across multiple states. In addition to the direct restitution for my legal costs and property damage, the class action settlement had provided compensation for HOA members who had been defrauded through misdirected dues and fake charitable donations. Several families had recovered thousands of dollars that they had contributed to what they believed were legitimate environmental protection efforts, money that was now helping them with real home improvements and community investments that actually benefited their neighborhoods. But the most satisfying outcome was the broader impact our case had on HOA fraud prevention and prosecution. Danielle had been invited to speak at legal conferences across the country about the tactics we had developed for investigating and prosecuting organized property fraud. And several states had updated their laws to make it harder for criminals to exploit homeowner associations for property theft schemes. The recording techniques we had used to document Becca's admissions had been incorporated into law enforcement training programs, and the financial investigation methods had helped prosecutors in other states recover millions of dollars in stolen assets from similar operations. The personal vindication was deeply satisfying, but the educational component of our experience had become equally important to me. Arizona State University had incorporated our case into several courses as a real-world example of how scientific expertise could be weaponized by criminals and how communities could protect themselves through informed skepticism and proper investigation. My own research had expanded to include the intersection of environmental science and legal protection, and I had been invited to consult on cases across the Southwest where property owners were facing similar challenges from organized fraud, networks posing as environmental activists. On a more personal note, the entire experience had strengthened my connection to both my family's legacy and my community in ways I never could have anticipated. The lake that my grandfather had studied for decades had become not just a site of scientific research, but a symbol of how ordinary people could successfully fight back against sophisticated criminals when they were willing to work together and follow evidence rather than emotion. The fact that we had preserved both the natural ecosystem and the community's integrity felt like exactly the kind of outcome that would have made my grandfather proud of his decision to leave me this responsibility. As the Conservation Day event wound down that evening, I found myself sitting alone by the water's edge, holding a cold beer and looking up at the framed photograph of my grandfather that I had hung on the old mesquite tree beside the lake. The photo showed him as a young geologist in the 1950s, standing beside the same water that now reflected the Arizona sunset, with the same crystal clarity that had fascinated him for 30 years of research. "Grandpa, we did it," I said, quietly, to the photograph. "We protected your lake. We protected the community, and we made sure that families like ours won't have to face this kind of threat again." The lake reflected the desert sky in perfect stillness, just as it had for generations before us and would for generations to come. But now it also represented something more, proof that ordinary people, armed with patience, intelligence, and determination, could successfully fight back against organized criminals who prey on communities through sophisticated manipulation and fraud. As I finished my beer and prepared to head inside, I realized that the real victory wasn't just protecting my family's property, but demonstrating that justice was still possible when people were willing to stand up for truth and work together to expose those who would exploit their trust and steal their futures. The story had come full circle from that Saturday morning when I first encountered Becca Langston and her fake environmental survey. But the ending was far better than I could have hoped. Not only had we protected the lake and exposed the criminals, but we had created a model for other communities facing similar threats and established legal precedents that would make such schemes much harder to execute in the future. Most importantly, we had proven that the truth always wins in the end, even when it's temporarily obscured by sophisticated lies and manipulation. The lake would continue to serve as a site of scientific research and community education, just as my grandfather had intended. But now it would also stand as a monument to the power of ordinary people to achieve extraordinary justice when they refused to be intimidated by those who would steal their heritage and destroy their community.